In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hey, it's John. I just wanted to beep in here and just say, like, real fast that you could use, when you're in this game, you can use platforms and websites. You can use them 100 times, and 100 times they work perfectly. But sometimes, once the one time it doesn't work and you're stuck kind of dealing with it, you know, it might throw a curveball at you. So if through this podcast you're listening to this and you're like, hey man, my boy John, why is he not on his A game? The problem is, we recorded this a few days after I had like this family thing that happened, and the tech issues leading up to it, leading up to recording this and stuff, was really fucking with me is what it was doing. So, but I hope you guys enjoy this show. Robert Anthony has a lot of fascinating things to say, and check out his blog because it is fascinating. He's very knowledgeable. So, without any further ado, here we go. Let's just do this. All right, welcome to the Abracast. You know me, I'm your host, John Towers, and tonight we have a guest on the line. He's the author of a very fascinating blog called What Was Written. You can find it at whatwaswritten.com, and he's the author of an upcoming book called Consecrated Evil. His name's Robert Anthony. Robert, are you still there? We've been having a little bit of problems connecting. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, man. Thank you for thank you for coming on, and your blog is fascinating. It seems like you just started posting on it. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's actually whathasbeenwritten.com. That's the proper name for it. But it's I actually had it set up for some time, but I felt like the posts I was putting were too lengthy for blog posts. I mean, for instance, I had an article on the afterlife, heaven and hell, 9 pages, and that's just for a blog post. So I'd like to put a lot more lengthier stuff in like a book, as you said, with Consecrated Evil. So for now, it could range anywhere from just brief, going over points or just a little more lengthy. But I kind of just, reapproached it recently. So
cool.
That's why that's that way.
Yeah, man. Okay. So, so it's fascinating, and it's refreshing these days to see the number of footnotes and citations that you put on your research. So, I want to give you a little bit of kudos on that before we get started. So before we dive into the blog, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Did you have a religious upbringing? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. Well, like you said, my name's Robert Anthony. I've been involved with ancient and biblical studies for about a decade or so. But one of the main points I just want to put out here first, is that the Bible is not a Christian source. Rather, it's an accumulation of ancient religious perspectives jammed in between a front and back cover put into publishing. And I like to make that point because I was part of Christianity in the past. And I used to hold the doctrines such as sola scriptura, or, just the preservation of the Bible. And it's basically viewed as one book, and it all has to be reconciled kind of approach. I was actually raised Catholic because my parents are Catholic, but that was just cultural. When I got older, I began studying more the Bible and found myself more on the Protestant side of things. So I first believe it was a Baptist church. But early on, even with that, there was a lot of denominational differences and doctrinal distinctions I was noticing. And I began studying what's known as the concept of false teachers in the Bible. And this is seen in chapter 2 or Acts or Jude. And so I began examining different like churches and just in general. And over time, it just seemed the more honest I got with the Bible and approaching it, the further away I was being driven from Christianity, because I believe to approach the Bible from a Christian perspective, you'd have to be dishonest in the examination of the text, at least as far as certain approaches go with consistent utilization. That's basically where I'm at today. So I'm documenting study from an honest perspective. And really there's, as far as the comparative religion stuff and the mythology I get into, that kind of just comes with the territory, as does Christianity. I mean, they're just kind of like the mosquitoes flying around. You just got to kind of deal with them. So I got a lot of theological experience in discussing those things with doctrines and dogma. With the other mythology, it's Bible references, the Egyptians or the Chaldeans and whatnot. So all these other texts from, Egyptian to Greco-Roman mythology, Hebraic mythology, and even the Mesopotamian regions. I like to include just about whatever I can, because when you understand the motifs and patterns, you could start to pick up on things that someone else who's ignorant of that may not see. So.
Yeah, so I noticed in your blog that you talk about the original Hebrew spellings of stuff. Do you speak Hebrew? Do you read Hebrew?
Don't speak it. I started studying Koine Greek in 2008. That's about the time frame we're doing stuff to you. And made it through, the entire grammar. I've translated portions, but periodic just work on the subject. The Hebrew I've handled more over the years, just as far as convenience goes, more like interlinear software approaches and things like that. The points I usually make require that. But the points I make with some of the distinctions is you have like the Paleo Hebrew, the Masoretic, and things like vowel pointing people may be familiar with. So that's why I like to get into that. I also like to use points as far as where words are used and their usage elsewhere, so as to draw correlations in the meanings, perhaps. But it's been more so, Koine Greek has been more the path I've taken. Hebrew's much more just, it's really like an archaeological approach with these things when you're dealing with like alleged dead languages and whatnot.
Okay. So do you consider yourself a magician, an occultist, or a scholar, or a blending of these things?
Well, the occultist title I'm fine with, as long as it's understood that I really have nothing to do with this whole modern so-called dark arts community that I see, this kind of like fashion show, if you will, of occultism.
Yeah.
I mean, just some of the stuff I see is outrageous, and I just seems a little bit exaggerated or superstitious. I mean, there's just no reason to accept some of this stuff as facts. I go down more the traditional occultism. Of course, occultus in Latin means hidden or concealed, and the ancient one, it was basically the concealed knowledge of the mystery. For instance, you have like this esoteric perspective of Jesus and the disciples in Mark chapter 5, but this will just tie into the Gnostic circles as well with that kind of approach. But really just the ancient esotericism and occultism is, that's what I prefer to go down, the foundational meanings of these things. But of course, throughout the ages, you have introductions of different perspectives, and you have kind of like sorts of things to deal with. So the occultism I'm involved with, I consider sincere and realistic, distinct from some stuff that people may think is a little bit just, not realistic. I mean, it's just some of these people say things, but it's like, what's the information? What's the sources? I like to go back to the ancient world, to antiquity.
Yeah, and that's what I was mentioning, the appreciation for like your level of footnotes and citations on your blog. Like usually it's hard to I guess it's not hard to find it, but it's hard to see people with that care of, check me out. Most people will just be like, you don't believe what I'm saying, just fucking Google it or something. So it's great that you take the time to list that stuff on your blog.
Well, I appreciate it. And, for people that would even read through using the footnotes, that'd be great. But, because, with all the scrolling down and whatnot, that's what I myself do when I read any works or even my own writing. So it's definitely informative. This way I don't have to go down all these rabbit trails at times. We could kind of just stash in the footnotes, but some of them get way more lengthy. Some of the footnotes turn almost into their own post, it seems, but it's definitely good to include that kind of stuff when you're dealing with these topics, because it's a very complex.
Yeah, and then it seems like you spend a little bit of time, I don't know if debating is the right word, but conversating with folks on, the topics, like the meanings of the words and how to interpret some of the scripture. So it's like a great kind of resource to have, like your footnotes, just like right there, just all compiled, ready to go. You'd be like, go read this,
Definitely. And, a lot of stuff I write is based on arguments I've had with people. I've dealt with Christians sometimes going back and forth, just even on Instagram. And, in discussing topics I already, have written on, I may even find out more based on arguments that I've come up with and then go back and toss more stuff in. So, it's more of just a compilation of my studies combined with just new things I'm discovering, because I'm always trying to learn more.
Right. All right. So I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. And you kind of already mentioned your view on the Bible. So I kind of want you to break it down for us, these thoughts on the Bible, and how like reading it as just this whole one complete work might be, well, I don't know if it's dangerous. I'm not sure I'd use the word dangerous, but it might add to like the general confusion surrounding Christianity. I was wondering if you could talk on that for a little bit.
Yeah, I got a post on my website on my blog, whathasbeenwritten.com, called "Is the Bible Biblical?" Now, this I've rewritten about 3 times already, just this subject. The Christian approach is like sola scriptura, and it's typically the 39 Old Testament books, Hebrew and Aramaic, usually translated into, like English, and with the famous translations, and then the 27 Greek New Testament. But they view it like one book. And so when they approach it, there's all these conflicting, opposing doctrines you come across that they will write across, just write out as well. I call it the 4 horsemen, because there's different ways to approach contradiction. Just some exception. Is it God's ways beyond ours? Is there textual error from a scribe? Or is it just, a contradiction and someone snucks, So it's just a ton of them we could list. But it seems they want to typically approach the one that's convenient, dogma. And so I feel my approach is honest. I give the example of the Qumran discovery with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They come across all these scrolls, they're distinct. There's no reason to assume that they're all to be viewed as one book. This could be a library of a bunch of contradicting beliefs that we don't really know. So the point I make is that to approach the Bible and allow for that is totally acceptable, even biblically, because in Jeremiah chapter 8, it speaks of the false pen of the scribe in the context of the law of Yahweh. That's problematic in the Christian perspective, because, they don't really allow for the false pen. In fact, in the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, it even says at the end, don't add to this, don't take away from it, otherwise that. It's kind of like, just, I wouldn't, just pinned on at the end. And just because of all, who knows what was going on with the book of Revelation, it seemed to be a scattered mess at times with all sorts of, it's not really chronological necessarily. It's kind of scattered. What's going on here may not be what's going on in the next verse, and then they're jumping around. My approach with not just the Bible, but just any ancient mythological writing is an honest approach, allowing for these things. And it's really not a dogmatic perspective. There's a lot of ambiguity involved. We have to allow for forgeries, evidence of them. We have to allow, I deal with the Greek New Testament, like I said, because even with Greek and Hebrew on it, they, as far as the grammar and studying it, as far as if you learn Hebrew, where do you even go? Because there's so much disagreement on how it's taught, like I said. So it's even problem in the grammars that they print that would tie into theological discussions. But as far as with the codices, you got Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and even later stuff like Coridithianus, dealing with these kind of Greek New Testaments. Says, yeah, there's all these distinctions and variations, but they're not really affecting the doctrines. But that's why what I do in my work is I go and show you that actually they are. And there's a lot of that stuff, and it's not a surprise. There's conflicting things with Dionysus or with the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, finding a bunch of contradicting descriptions or just discrepancies is not unusual in this kind of ancient lore.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost like a disservice to try to connect them all. You know what I mean? Like, it seems to probably be a lot more wisdom we can choke out of these things if we just took them for what they were supposed to be. Like when discovering the Nag Hammadi text or something, and some of those things could easily just fit right. Into the Bible, and it leads you to ask a question of why were they excluded in the first place?
Exactly. And where were they to exclude it from? Because we have different canons, like I said, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain writings that are not in the Bible. And that's dealing with the Old Testament. With the New, you have the Ethiopian church. They have more books in there making these decisions. What's the authority? Well, when we look at the Bible itself, it doesn't really spell it out too clear. In fact, it doesn't say that Jesus was opening up a Bible. I like to make the point that the Bible is not biblical. Yeah. Jesus opened up a Isaiah scroll, I believe in Luke chapter 4. He opened up and read from it. That's not really the same, description as the Bible today. And as far as the original languages, it becomes even more of a big, chaotic, just set of arguments because, what are we going with? Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic? Well, what about, in the surrounding regions we may have evidence for? Like you said with the Nag Hammadi, I have a post on the Gnostic Testament because one of my arguments is that the content, at least with much of the New Testament, even in the Gospels, is Gnostic. And there's this distinction in how Gnosticism's even defined. It's just use the dating method, which I have a problem with if that's all we're relying on. I like to use the content and the context and the correlatives and whatnot. These things like this seem like a much more solid foundation, and a basis for an argument as far as what Gnosticism is. And when you do that, you not only find, pre-New Testament concepts of tying to Gnosticism, but you see that, some of the stuff like that Jesus is teaching in the gospel, you could find that same kind of saying in the Gospel of Thomas, which is, we could easily just argue, and other examples could be listed. So I think that the point is that there's stuff in the New Testament that fits what we categorize as Gnosticism that's against the Christian perspectives.
Yeah. So think of if we were able to take Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John and just focus them on what they say versus rather than how they tell the story almost the exact same way. You know what I mean? I think that we might be able to split test or compare and contrast the different messages. And there's some New Testament books, the Gospels, that are, vastly more Gnostic in nature than other ones. You mentioned, actually, you specifically mentioned Matthew 27 when you're talking about, if you read it carefully, he actually says, we nailed this dude Simon to the fucking cross. You know what I mean? And I think that's fascinating. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Just like a close examination of the text will bring that to you, but there's some of the other one, they don't match that way. So it's you're kind of shining a light on how how it's not like all one truth, one book. You know, it's more like a Reader's Digest or like a Cliff Notes version of the different things, like taped together and like put under one cover or something. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And really, with the distinctions, it's hard to tell which way we can go. And that's why, like I said, there's this ambiguous concept you got to always tie into it, because it could go different ways. With the Matthew one, this may not agree with the other ones, but as to why that's the case, we can only speculate, because you do have that kind of anti-physical crucifixion in Gnosticism, that it wasn't a physical crucifixion. However, it depends on, the esoteric context, what's being meant by the crucifixion, the spiritual applications in the meaning, the stuff he ties in with correlating himself with the serpent being lifted up with Moses. So the Son of Man will be, crucified. There's a connection with the serpent he's making that ties back to that's a whole other direction you can go on to, because then we can make correlations with the serpents or snakes, Medusa and Yahweh, because there's this feminine side of Yahweh in the Bible as well, of wisdom being the feminine, and that Yahweh is identified as this. And you have all these Medusa correlations where, like Lot's wife turning back and just turning to a pillar of salt, or striking people blind, or you can't see God or you'll die, is this big thing going on. It's very similar to that kind of motif. But with the Gnosticism, of course, when we allow for the opposing gospels and all that, it's to be honest. It's to just say, listen, there's no reason to assume these all need to be reconciled. Here's some perspectives. Here's some correlations. And when I approach it that way, I think we'll get better results.
Yeah, it's like a way. It's like a way of adding context to the stories, not trying to make them not trying. Nowadays in pop culture, they would call it retconning or something, or like jumping through these wild logic hoops to make things work together.
Yeah.
But the serpent thing is interesting. Obviously, like the serpent in the garden, and then back to the Moses, the magic duel they have with the Egyptian magicians and stuff is all snakes and everything. So yeah, that's it is super interesting.
Yeah, and of course another. I had an article. I may have to get excerpts and put a new post on it. It was called "Back to Genesis" on the earlier "What Has Been Written" blog that I had, like I was saying before, and basically I point out just the nature of Genesis, just how it admits it's anachronistic in the text itself. Now, the Christians typically view the serpent in the garden as Satan himself, and the passage I'll utilize is Revelation 12:9. However, it just says it's the serpent of old. I mean, Yahweh makes sea creature serpents in Genesis. All of them are serpents of old at that point. Which serpent is the serpent of old? It doesn't demand any of these things. It's just, again, Christian doctrine and the bias coming in. But there's really no forcing of that to be what's going on. And if you actually look at it, the view actually was that the serpent is basically the good character, and Yahweh is the one using the deception in Genesis. But you also get stuff with the Septuagint when you're going to go with it, that in the Assyrians in the Garden of Eden with Adam before anyone, before mankind's on the earth. It's just you got these bloopers in the text, it seems at times, but it depends what text we go with, because there is distinctions in the Septuagint. That ties into the serpent stuff, and then of course you got like with Leviathan and Dracon in the Greek, and all the astrotheological connections I can get into with that and whatnot. But yeah, there's definitely a lot on the serpent mythology.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you opened the door here. So I actually wanted to ask you about this astrological procession. I used it in my latest graphic novel. It's called The Ages. And it's about this guy that lived a horrifically long amount of time, and it's about other stuff too, but I used the astrological procession as a way to mark the book out. So we begin in the age of Gemini, and then Taurus, and then Aries, and so forth. Anyhow, you have an article on your blog sort of picking on the Zeitgeist movie for their spiel on this astrological procession, which we've picked on Zeitgeist too. You criticize the way that you've criticized the way that they link Taurus. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and maybe get into this. I think it's fascinating, this this god of the mountain stuff. I was wondering if you can talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Zeitgeist, it gets brought up a lot in what I do. I'm involved with comparative mythology. So when I'm bringing stuff up, I've heard it brought up a lot. I mean, I remember when it was being discussed back in 2008, even on YouTube. But, it's like it gets brought up so many times. And just when you look at it, although there's some points as far as, Jesus, the son and all that, it's not that I have a problem with the whole film, but some of the points are just simply just ridiculous, in my opinion, as far as just doing the work right. There is absolutely no reason to compare Taurus with the horns there in the context of sacred mountain worship, a clear motif. And that's really what's going on. If you read the surrounding context of Mount Sinai, it's all mountain correlated. In fact, the entire understanding of Yahweh meeting Moses can be paralleled with the sun setting at the mountain's peak, because not to be anachronistic and read just volcanoes back, as some people say Yahweh's a volcano god, it was rather their understanding of volcanoes appears to be that Yahweh touched the mountains and they smoked, like I believe Psalm 18. Exodus, you got this connection with Moses as, in essence, the man of the mountain, but with texts that I could bring up, Deuteronomy, actually the God of the mountain. And there's basically this whole, Moses with the horns. That gets disputed over if it means like the light rays or the horns. It's clearly horns. It's used in the Psalms for the bulls. And, of course, you got the gold in the context, which appears to be basically the burning bull, because the gold appears to associate itself with fire in the Bible, while you'll have things like bronze associated with Zechariah. But you got this bronze, I believe, altar with horns in the context of the mountain, the ram's horn in the context of going up the mountain, Moses with the horns correlated with the mountain, and of course they're burning horned animals on it. It appears their understanding was that the burning volcanic activity was in essence burn the horns, appease the gods. And this, gets like in this kind of nature reference kind of context. It's not just that text alone, because they do this with like Leviathan. When you read in like the book of Job, for instance, they put Leviathan in the star context in Job chapter 3. Later on, they give descriptions about Leviathan, the dragon. And, with like the boiling and shining on the water appears to be the sun setting on the water. And then the spitting out of fire goes right in a sky motif where it's basically, the moon letting go of the sun is the spitting of the fire. So you got that with, in Chinese mythology, not only with dragon, but also Tiangu, kind of like the flying dog, that Norse with skull and soul. You got all this solar mythological connection going on. So it's that, again, taking nature and, personifying it with the stories, kind of like with, like the Grim Reaper, like that kind of stuff. So it is based on the evidence. If we're just going to go grabbing any horns and associate with Taurus, that's not really strong of an argument. But when you have that sacred mountain worship, I believe that's getting ignored there, just not done carefully. But it's more than that, because they also mention I list other points in the film as well. Like with the three kings, it doesn't even say there's three kings. It's rather the correct three is the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I point that out just as kind of like in the work. I want to get it. But there's so many different directions these things could go in. And passage in Deuteronomy where Moses, I believe, is identified as Yahweh, that actually had a Christian arguing this with me at one point. And it's in Deuteronomy 29. And Moses is speaking in the context, and he says, I am Yahweh, your God. And basically, it's just Moses speaking in the surrounding context. So it looks like this would be known as a deification passage. It's basically when they're taking the mere man Moses that we find in the writings and deifying him. This is a common thing that happens. The passages identifying him as Yahweh. You got this kind of evidence with Jesus as well. Texts where it would seem that he's not God, but then texts where he is. That's deification evidence. When you got someone, exalted as to a God level. They do it all as his throne becomes, God's throne, as it goes with it, with the arrival of Jesus and all that. So that's, the evidence being used there with the whole Moses thing.
Learn more at theabracast.com. Get graphic elements, notes, worksheets, and text versions of selected episodes, as well as access to the private Abracast workgroup by signing into the mailing list. Get all that, plus exclusive episodes, by supporting the show and becoming a subscriber at subscribestar.com.
Yeah, so okay, so man, there's so much to unpack right here. So the Moses, like the Moses thing, and you said the Christian that was kind of debating you about the tense or who was actually speaking. So would that just be like there was a change of stage direction, or there was a change of who was talking when Moses was standing up there going, "Hey, I'm Yahweh now"? Like, how do you figure that? Like, how do you figure that out?
All right. Well, just examining the text carefully, because I've dealt with this repeatedly through the years, even with someone else as well. But walking through the text with speaker change, there has to be for instance, one of the most complicated points of speaker change is in Revelation chapter 22, right at the end, where it's hard to tell if it's John, the angel, or Jesus. And so you'll have the words in red kind of being shifted, not too clear. Well, there's nothing here indicating that Moses is not speaking from his own perspective. And verse 2 says, Moses called all Israel and said to them, goes on to speak, points out the things he did with them, and says, I am Yahweh your God. This is very odd that the NIV changes the text, because I guess they're picking up on what's going on here, with suggests the evidence of deification, like I said. So they go with the NIV and, these things that they allegedly add into the Hebrew, but that goes against the command in the Bible not to add to God's words at that point, if you believe the Hebrews do. So, for the NIV to add in that it's just God saying that or whatever, to it, but then at that point you got problems with the other issues, and we can, like the language and all that you're talking about. So I would definitely take that. But you also see, if I could just add, you also see a hint towards like this, divine Moses, because he gets treated very special in Numbers chapter 12. But you got in Exodus 7:1, he just says that God just says he's going to make him God to Pharaoh. So, but Elohim or El gets thrown around the Bible for like angels and men, and there's all these contexts, but it still is evidence. Just like a Christian will take a verse that says Jesus is God, like Titus 2:13, for instance, the great God and Savior. Someone could argue that about Moses. He led the people out. He was the God to Pharaoh. As the evidence of is it Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. This would just fit with that. But then just the whole like horned Moses on the mountain thing. There's a passage in Habakkuk I also use, and it's just this like correlation combination with Yahweh and Moses that definitely appears to fit the sun setting at the peak concept with the following volcanic activity. But this just cuts into different things.
Yeah, so the volcano thing is interesting because it evokes, Moses leading his folks out of Egypt, like the pillar of fire and all this kind of stuff. So, I guess I just kind of thought about like as you were speaking, I thought about like the linkages between, like how many similarities Moses' story has with Jesus. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. You could draw correlations between them, but people draw, just with the basket story, I think with like Sargon and stuff like that with Moses and this Egyptian connection. But here's the other thing with the character I want to point out is just because you have all these descriptions doesn't mean it was always that way. It could have been snowballed that way. Moses may be based off of, for all we know, some man that led some kind of break out of some bondage, led some people past some location and convinced him he was talking to someone on a mountain, and that's why no one else could come up, for all we know, because it kind of leaves a popcorn trail of evidence of deception at that point. Yeah, no one could see God, except for me. But what I point out is that, with Jesus himself in the Gospels points to Moses and just, draws a connection. He even appears with them with Elijah or whatever, but I guess it depends what kind of connection. Could say that Moses is a solar deity, and there may have been some confusion with, like I said, the sun visiting the mountain that connects into that. But I think that's what fits the evidence better. You get the connection with Joseph, with the brothers, with the 12 tribes and the 12 disciples. Of course, people argue would be the zodiac. You get you have the giving of the law with Moses and with Jesus. One thing with Moses is that when he dies, he's buried on the, and that also appears to kind of tie into the whole sacrificial thing, because if he's the God of the mountain personified, then the mountain burning, does that mean Moses burning? Well, that appears to fit in with the sacrifice, like Jesus, which is like a Ouroboros, basically, with Jesus at least resurrecting himself from the dead. So this, or with Odin, or you have all sorts of self-sacrifice going on that would also fit that evidence. We could connect with Jesus.
Yeah, that's that's interesting. I've been just sitting here taking notes. So, you mentioned earlier about the three kings and the belt of Orion and the frankincense and the myrrh and all this. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, but because that with zeitgeist, if it's not Taurus there, what if someone wanted to ask, well, what would be a Taurus example? I think Taurus usually comes in a pack with Orion as a battle. We see this with Gilgamesh and Humbaba. You see it with Theseus and Minotaur in Greek mythology. And of course, I would argue Goliath, David versus Goliath. And basically, and I can get into that if you want, but with Orion at that point, because it's the warrior, it's usually like a king, a warrior, going to battle type of thing. And you see it with Gilgamesh. Now, in Gilgamesh, the Theseus, Minotaur, and with David, they all decapitate the one they're against. And if someone thinks that, that's not enough, if you compare the Epic of Gilgamesh and you look at Tablet 5 and 6, which appears to just be kind of a retelling of itself, kind of like you have Genesis 19, but in Judges 19, there's a very similar people dead 1 and 2, like the same movie, just done differently kind of thing. But you have evidence of that. You have evidence with that with the Gilgamesh, because he's going to battle the Bull of Heaven and Humbaba, where there is archaeological evidence and scaled. What's interesting is that Goliath's armor has scales. And if there's any question that he's horned, besides just the indication and the parallelism, there is, I believe, a Mycenaean warrior vase, and the Mycenaean culture correlates with the evidence with the Philistines. And we do have evidence of them having the horn on the helmet. But of course, you have them saying basically the same kind of thing that Humbaba says to Gilgamesh about giving his flesh to the beast. So this all these correlations start popping up once you figure out the motif, in other words. And that would be a great example of the Orion and Taurus, because you have the consistency in the decapitation, you have the consistency in the descriptive battle, and of course you just have the warrior monster kind of motif popping up again. We got a lot more evidence for that kind of stuff with Taurus or Orion.
Yeah, so going back to, you were kind of talking about the story of God versus Leviathan earlier, and I always thought the Old Testament God, I always cast him kind of in the role of a sky god, not a mountain god, because of Job. Like, this whole rant he gets into when he's telling Job about the time he killed Leviathan. And I always link that with like Thor and the Midgard serpent, or the Sumerian thing. Who was it? Tiamat and Marduk. You know, they all fight.
Marduk, right?
Yeah, like these sky gods are all fighting these like serpent creatures or whatever. And like, even Marduk, when he gets done killing the dragon, he uses its corpse like to construct the earth. And so I always kind of tied God into like a storm god or a sky god because of that. So the reason I'm bringing it up is, I mean, you were just kind of mentioning like the scales, and when God's talking about Leviathan, he also talks about how his scales look like battered shields layered on themselves. And so that kind of goes into this monster versus warrior thing too. Like, do you see a connection there?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely another motif. And you even have it in Isaiah 27, I believe, where just God's going to slay Leviathan. But of course, Leviathan shows his evidence as being the river. And you can see that in Psalm 74, where he's put in the context of the river and the serpents, and God splits the heads of the serpents. In Genesis, it's the same, with heads for the rivers. Then you have connection with, so you have the connection with that, but then with the thing you're bringing up goes back to like the primordial age with the chaos and the construction. I've heard it argued that the separating of the waters in Genesis is the separating of the dragons of water. But what I would argue is it says in the Psalms that God fed Leviathan to the people. When did he feed Leviathan to the people? Well, if you go back into the story with the Israelites in the Old Testament, he fed them the water, and that is him feeding Leviathan. And the Hebrew is used for, if someone argues like the eating, would have to be like some solid food or something. It's used for, I believe, like oil or
consumption.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by this whole like who defines the words, because you can find errors in like Strong's Concordance I can document as far as the Hebrew. So that's why there's a lot more code cracking to do than just, I learned Hebrew. It's you see these things just theologically and contextually as far as what we're working with. But yeah, that's definitely popping up with that. And then you have, Satan. I mean, Leviathan, I'd argue, because like Job, you're bringing up in Job chapter 3, he's put in the context of the stars. And later I believe he speaks about his eye as a morning star. So, that could fit Draco, but that could also fit like the sisters, because you have the 7-headed dragon connection with the numbers in Revelation with the Dracon, the dragon, which could go back to Leviathan. So 7. And you also have in Buddhism a 7-headed serpent with the thing I was talking about before with the solar ecliptic lore, that the solar deity, if he doesn't let go of the sun, his head will be chopped in 7 pieces. So you get that 7-headed serpent thing again.
Yeah, and then you get like
Yahweh being like, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, and then you get like the Hydra where you cut one head off and 2 head grows out. Like, I wonder if that has anything to do with that. Yeah.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, when you're going with just what they're observing, it's like one of those like deformed reptiles with multiple heads for all we knew, and exaggerated it. I mean, and connect it with the rivers. But I wanted to point out what you also asked was as far as Yahweh being the storm god, definitely. But I believe Yahweh is a polytheistic deity in many. You do have the monotheism aspect going on, with the Israelites, but you have the polytheistic evidence we can get into with Yahweh being not only the mountain, but also the sun, but also, just the general sky deity. And then again, whoever else we can draw connection with that Yahweh is identified as. Now, in Joshua chapter 10, there's this, famous passage about the sun standing still. And if you read it closely, actually, it's Joshua's saying to Yahweh, sun stand still. That's directed to Yahweh. He's identifying Yahweh as the sun there, and the sun heeds his voice in the context, so that day Yahweh heeded the voice of a man. This is just like in John 20, identified as God by Thomas. He says to him, the Christians would argue, my Lord, my God. Well, he's saying to Yahweh, sun and moon stand still. So that we would count as evidence as the solar. But you also have it in the Psalms. And a shield, some translations say, but actually it could be translated protector. And that's exactly what you see going on in Joshua chapter 10. So there is the solar deity evidence. That's not really that disputed, depending on where you go. Connecting with to the polytheistic stuff. In Joshua 24:19, it says, I believe, Kadoshim Elohim, which the adjective for Kadoshim is correlated with the Elohim. So he is holy. Don't translate it that way in these Christian they put that he is a holy God. However, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 4, 7 and 8, they do translate it mighty gods because it's the pagan Philistines saying it. But it's the same Hebrew construction as far as the adjectival involvement, I would argue. So that would be more evidence of the polytheistic Yahweh.
Yeah, well, we're comic book guys here. So, like, Alan Moore decodes Elohim as plural and masculine and feminine. You know, he's like, who are all these who are all these gods that this word Elohim, encompasses? So I think of that, all that kind of stuff is very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And you and really what the argument with the plural with Elohim is that people may say, like, well, it's used in Genesis 1 with like bara or whatever it is used with singulars. But the argument I was just making kind of traps that because it's used with the plural adjective, not singular. And they do translate it gods when it's the Philistines talking, because they could just argue, well, they didn't know, the right doctrine. But you do have Joshua saying it in Joshua 24:19 as well. But then you have these, people try to argue with the Trinity and all that. I believe it goes beyond the triadic deity, which is another thing I get into. But than that, and all sorts of variations in between. So
yeah, well, even in Genesis, even in Genesis, it's like God says, let us make them in the image of ourselves, or something like that, where he's putting like a plural spin on it, so it's like, it's like kind of right there.
Yeah, definitely. That's another example. That happens a lot. He does it in Genesis 11. He says, let us go down and confuse their language.
Yep. We talk a lot about we talk a lot about the Tower of Babel and Nimrod here. We hours and hours on it. Yeah. So, so this is all very interesting. I'm addicted to this Leviathan stuff. I'm convinced that this story of Leviathan points to Gnosticism as well, because it points to the flawed nature of God, where it's like, how can he be surprised and be proud that he beat something that he knowingly created? Because he's like, right. Look at, man, I'm the one that beat Leviathan, and you're just like, well, what are you talking about? Like, do you have, we spoke about Gnosticism briefly at the beginning. Do you have any thoughts about that aspect of it?
Yeah, as far as like the demiurge view or the Marcionite perspective and Gnosticism, Yahweh being viewed as the evil deity. Well, of course, and as far as getting beaten, he loses the wrestling match to Jacob, and it says in Hosea too that he prevailed against him. So, Moses stands up to Yahweh in Exodus 32, I believe it is, and changes his mind. And his argument is, don't do that, because then the Egyptians will talk all this stuff. So, change your mind. And Yahweh ends up changing his mind. But then I think they end up killing them in the story anyway or whatever. So there might have been a whole dispute on that, changing it. The thing I'm pointing out is that you have not only that, but in Genesis, creation story is pretty clear. Is another thing that could be pointed out. In the second one with Eden and all that, Yahweh basically goes to make, with the animals, basically admits that it was a mess up, and he starts over and does the woman after that. Like it took 2 times to get it the right way. But here's the thing, the assumption in the anachronistic mind of the Christian, circle is that Yahweh has to be like perfect in this way where like he can't do these things, even though he's supposed to be the source of their morality, but now they're like judging how he has to be, it seems. What really determines good and bad behavior in Yahweh, would be the argument to cut in. However, you have this kind of thing with even the Ojibwa tribe and Native American mythology, because they even have it that you could have these flawed kind of creator spirits. You got that kind of motif, the flawed creator, where he's creating messed up things and there's a greater spirit creating things. So Yahweh doesn't necessarily have to get it right the first time. In fact, the book of Job makes it sound like he's kind of just respected because he created the world, not just necessarily at the snap of a finger, but almost like building it like a house, because he's laid the foundations. He did this. It's almost like saying, well, look at all this stuff I did. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of labor, And so this view of Yahweh is as a bodily figure, or at least it's personified for that when you're dealing with the astrotheology, but it could also be based on a lot of other lightning storms, in their paranoid war setting. They may just thought, well, that might just be a divine being shooting arrows up there. What else could that be? And this gets turned into stories for all we know. It's another example of like the explanation, kind of the shell of it that you could cut down into.
Yeah, so, it reminds me kind of the way that the ancient Greeks dealt with their gods, where they're like, their gods were always making fucked up decisions, and they were always doing wrong shit. Like you said, like, you gotta wash the morality, well, you didn't say you gotta wash the morality out of it, but you basically was like, you can kind of wash the morality out of it and think about, this guy is just like you said, he's just the dude laying the foundation of the house or something. So he's laying the foundation of the house, and he's like, look, the foundation got flooded. I went down there. I had to fight this fucking crazy basement serpent, he's like just a schlub. Like, he's like always kind of messing stuff up, I think that's very interesting.
And he'll just, in the text, and here's the other thing is, Christians have problem with that today, it seems, much of the time. The ancients didn't. They were totally fine with Yahweh just being this kind of just opposite of righteousness character, because in the book of Job he even says, who will appoint my day in court? He be condemned, he says. I think it's Job chapter 9, if I got that right. But he says, even if I was righteous, I'd be condemned. Well, at that point, there is no, up and down. It's just a bully scenario that you just don't want to get stepped on. But that's kind of how they view God in Isaiah 44, because they're just grasshoppers in a bucket, it says as well in Isaiah. So their view is kind of just like, do what he says, don't get stepped on kind of perspective, not this Christian thing where it's like, oh, no, God doesn't do any of that. But then you open the Bible up and you see, well, you got the slaughtering going on here. You got the famine here. What are you talking about? And this is what I mean by Christianity's approach, just not being honest.
Yeah, man, it's wild. Like, it's this. I think it's these. I don't know. I don't want to. I'm not sure. I think it's like people like raised on like Sunday school versions of these stories and not actually reading or like understanding what they're reading. What do you think about that?
Well, this could also tie into the whole thing with the occult, as far as the definition in the ancient world of occultus, the hidden or concealed, because what was hidden isn't necessarily digging, and burying it in the ground so no one could see it. It's rather just kind of hidden out in the open, is how Jesus would explain it, where it's basically seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, and you have this kind of whole esoteric study, and with the Gnostics and with other arguments like the faith and the involvement and whatnot and the labor in the word. But this is their perspective, is to kind of crucify themselves daily, in this kind of disciplined lifestyle. So you got that kind of involvement in just those sort of things, but it could go in so many different directions depending on how you're understanding the esotericism. So there was like hidden meanings, but they're even out in the open in them. I'm sorry, what was the point you were asking again? I think I got off on
well,
I got confused there for a second.
I think that I was just kind of asking your point of view on, God, I don't even remember what I asked. So
yeah, it's just and that's really good point with the Bible, is that's where you end up. We're jumping in so many different directions, just reading it consistently. You get this kind of like, how could this not be? Even with the Old and New Testament, admittingly contradicting. It's just, that's how you just change a religion. But when the Gnostics do it, in Testament, this is a problem, the New Testament, this and that part, oh, we can't do that, but we could just overthrow these things. We got the new covenant. You could eat all these foods you weren't allowed to in Leviticus 11. You could go and you could do all these things now. I mean, they were told if anyone came doing that to basically just, put them in the Hebraic law. But that's, the argument with Jesus coming along. So it's this whole dispute with the messianic prophecies and all that kind of stuff you got to get into, which it involves just great bias and anachronistic means at times on the Christian part. But the whole concept of prophecy and divination is even paralleled in the Bible, and that's really, I don't know if we're going to get into that, but as far as with my book and with some of the stuff with witchcraft, I can get into, I could bring that up if you want.
Yeah. So let's talk about your book for a second. It's upcoming, right? And, it's I hope I don't fuck the name of it up. It's called Consecrated Evil, right? So tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, I plan to release it in 2020, but like I said, there's just so much information that I want to put it into it in a book form. And so instead of just cutting down the articles, but the real essence of it is the concept of consecrated evil is basically an introduction for many people, it seems, because they have this misunderstanding of what the Bible even is. The consecrated evil is a focus on the biblical occultism. It's like, and I see this often with the witch, like the witches, for instance, that's condemned. And yet that same practice God's prophets perform. And so it's a consecrated evil. But the point there is that when people aren't understanding the parallelism between the occult description of the biblical characters and that of witchcraft or the grimoire, like the Key of Solomon, I draw parallels with that in Leviticus 14 through 16 with the exorcism of the bath and the bath. You have all these correlations going on with that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, that Leviticus and the lesser key, or the Key of Solomon stuff on your blog was fascinating. We spent a lot of time in Solomon land here. Like we spent a lot of time in the books of Solomon, the Solomonic text. And right. As soon as I read that, I was like, oh shit. I didn't together. So I really appreciated that, like the section of Leviticus that's talking about how you spiritually bathe yourself is mirrored with the, this Key of Solomon book. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and when you also have the kind of like side-by-side package with the Testament of Solomon as well, with the key, it's like Leviticus ties just mythological tales, with like the fire coming out of Aaron's sons, for instance. You'd have this kind of like just the poetic mythology. Then it just cuts into like this instruction manual out of nowhere. And so I believe this is just this placing together of just a whole, like we find with the Dead Sea Scrolls in Nag Hammadi, just is maybe just an example. So much paperwork on the table. They're just like, well, here you go. And now we have parallels of grimoire going on in Leviticus 14 through 16, and so with the Key of Solomon. So that's one thing I pointed out, and again ties into my approach for the Bible. Because if you're a Christian, are you ever going to see anything like that? The Christian idea seems to be that the other mythology and the other lands is just all condemned, and that's, like I said, with consecrated evil, it's to show there's really no difference. Because it's one thing to say, well, they're completely different than ours. We don't do these kind of things. But when you have to say, like, yeah, but when the prophets do it, it's okay because God said so. That's the consecrated evil. It's to kind of open up the chest, on the biblical occult, but also get into how the traditional occult authors, back to, even with Hermes Trismegistus, is all just biblically correlated. And then that just ties down through the centuries with others. But the original occult authors were biblically involved. And it seems today you got this kind of like, or Diana the Huntress maybe, and involve it with like their witchcraft, but then the Bible, it seems people just kind of want nothing to do with it, and it's just like a lot of the stuff they're using in their culture, like 666, the Bible made that evil. And I don't want to drop the birthday cake on the floor, but one of the Greek texts is 616. A lot of people realize that there's one that's 616 in the mark of the beast. So if you don't even know the mark of the beast is, but anyway, like that type of stuff just ties into the problems with their approach. And in my book, I want to, point out just all this biblical mythology and occultism, but also get into how the earlier authors weren't really biased against the Bible. There's no reason, just other mythological descriptions in writing and whatnot. We shouldn't just have this bias of like, well, the Bible's different for what reason? People, that's what gets into the theological debates and all that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned like witchcraft. Okay. You really have this talent to like say a bunch of stuff that's we need like an hour to unpack. So, you just mentioned this thing about when the prophets do witchcraft, it's okay. And so I know that you have this whole kind of thing on like necromancy. Would you like to talk a little bit about necromancy and the prophets?
Yeah, I mean, just to point out, the passage I was thinking of was in Micah chapter 3, 6 and 7. It says, "Wherefore night shall be for you without a vision, and it will be dark for you without divination." And what I point out is that the vision, like the vision seers, is the problem. Numbers chapter 12, verse 6 is one I list. So their divination and prophecy, this foretelling of the future, or even doom pronouncers you have with some of the, this kind of call it, they just kind of take a natural event and just say, yeah, that was Yahweh punishing you with like the bad karma because you didn't listen to what I said. Well, it turns out, if you got 100 people taking a guess at the weather, 90 come the false prophets. The guy who got it right has the power now to write what he wants. That seems to be the process of where this whole practice comes from. But that's just in part because the witchcraft is very parallel. And what I get into is with the necromancy to ancient sources, of course. And the ones that are usually brought up are the witch of Endor in 1 Samuel chapter 28, or like the Odyssey, for instance, with the Catabasis, the dead speaking with him there. However, the problem I have is when people, people are welcome to believe what they want, as far as like talking to the dead. But what I point out is that the traditional ancient view of necromancy, which is, it wasn't viewed that way. These are esoteric cultures. And that's one of the other problems I have is when we take these writings and just start reading them in these like odd ways found out of the themes they're found in. These are esoteric cultures. There's just coded in all these like, just like code, phrases and whatnot. So we have this kind of thing in 1 Samuel 28. Now, the traditional definition of necromancy, as based on the evidence, is just simply the seeking of enlightenment through the context of the dead. It's not, dead people coming up and speaking to you physically like they're alive and you're just talking to them. It's this whole thing that you could just see with like even the Egyptian Book of the Dead, I would argue, is a classic example of traditional necromancy. It's also forth in the light. And of course, with the content you have, you can draw parallels with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Why are these just words of wisdom, if you will, put in the context of the dead? Well, this is the whole ancient view of necromancy, is that the dead is this humbling involvement of a context where you can like learn, it's kind of like animism, like the forest speaking to you through its, like I use the example of like a burnt forest. If you saw a burnt forest, it kind of says without saying anything. Same thing here, just the corpse. So that's the point that I make with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan, the Hebraic culture. The witch of Endor in the story, she's seen calling Samuel's dead body up out of the ground. Problem is that the Hebrews believed that the dead knew nothing about the earth once they're gone, and that they wouldn't come back. Like in Ecclesiastes and Job, it speaks about this. Summoning of the dead and the corpse speakings found in Job chapter 12. It says basically that speak to the earth and it will teach you. And they just have this whole thing of connecting the earth with the dead in the ancient world. To dust man returns. Those who sleep in the dust of the earth will resurrect in Daniel chapter 12. In the Metamorphosis of Ovid, it does this with the mother, with the bones and the rocks and the earth and all this. And really, that's a good example there, because in that, on a basically she's feared to violate her mother's bones. When Samuel comes up in 1 Samuel 28, he says, "Why have you disturbed me?" And someone may argue like, well, he was resting in heaven and he called him back. But actually, it's this ancient thing of violating the bones. Just being amongst the dead is disturbing him. It's kind of like an Indian burial ground or something kind of view, it seems. So the whole essence of the story, yeah, exactly, because he's found talking with the ghost and people think that with that kind of thing, but when in the ancient cultures don't put it that way, even with the whole Egyptian archaeological display, it just, people dispute on what it even means because it's esoteric, but it's pretty clear it's just this display of death and wisdom simultaneously. So that's the whole thing. It's a simultaneous context of enlightenment and death that the ancients would do. And esoteric stories, later people walk around claiming to speak with the dead. But of course, we have, like I said, with 1 Samuel 28, the whole point in the story, which appears to be written biasly, by the way, whoever wrote this seems to be in favor of witchcraft, because if you read, the medium doesn't really do anything wrong. I mean, she's against doing the thing. Saul's kind of pushing her to it. She's concerned with him later on that she wants him to eat because he's weak. It's just the Good Samaritan. Whoever wrote this seems to be putting witchcraft in a good light and basically saying, yeah, Yahweh didn't answer Saul, but the witch did, and it comes up. But of course, this appears to be his depiction of the dead corpse of Samuel is saying basically, you're a dead man because you're in opposition to God's prophet. You see that with Moses in Numbers 12. But is, you're in opposition to the dead man. What could be learned from the corpse? That you're the dead man. And interestingly enough, Saul in Hebrew letters as Sheol. Just might, with the whole vowel pointing thing, like I was saying before, the distinctions. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's something you have to deal with. You don't have the Masoretic, pointing evidence there. So you have King Saul is basically death. He's walking death. And of course, in the context, the whole to Yahweh and Samuel, and of course, he ends up committing suicide because his arm bearer wouldn't, thrust him with his sword or whatever. What's interesting, one more thing is in 1 Chronicles 10, 1 Chronicles 10, it basically, the reason in Samuel is that he was dying. He was committing suicide. 1 Chronicles 10 out of nowhere just brings this incident up and says he died because he saw a medium for guidance. And that's why God killed him. So it looks like that was almost like a combat against the good context of the witch in 1 Samuel 28. It looks like you'd have these writings disputing each other kind of thing going on.
Wow, man. I mean, there's a lot here still.
Hey, I could go on.
But... well, I mean, do you want to finish it? Like, do you want to finish it off a little bit and then we'll end up, or you just want to end it here?
Yeah, it's fine with me. I mean, I was just going to include, since we're talking the necromancy, and like I said, I have an article of this on my blog at whathasbeenwritten.com, but it's also this solar ecliptic concept, because the dead, being raised in the seeking of, advice or wisdom or divination is parallel to the sun escaping the darkness, coming into light, or in this case, into life. And what's interesting is when you understand that, because besides just Jesus raising himself from the dead in the morning, with the sun, you have in the Odyssey the climbing the starry sky and then the darkness, or when it goes down. So, it's a solar eclipse or it's the sunset. Right in that context, he starts talking to the dead. So they had this correlation between the sun and necromancy as well. But what's very interesting to me, and what I point out often, is that Miriam in Hebrew, Mary, Miriam actually in Hebrew means rebelliously. And this has to do with witchcraft in 1 Samuel 15:23. If you go in the Hebrew term is the sin of witchcraft. And what's interesting about that is that you see this whole correlation in the Gospels with the Marys, with like the ancient, you could have the triadic concept with Hecate, Graces in Greek and Greco-Roman myth. The Graces, the dancing naked sisters who were found rubbing oil on Aphrodite. You got all these Marys rubbing oil on Jesus. In the Apuleius, basically, it has to do with this transforming into animals. What's interesting is that, in the context of Jesus having oil put on him and when he raises in the tomb, Mark 16 notes that he changed forms. And so I find that very convincing as far as, because it's a disputed text. It's not found in the other version of Mark. It's known as the longer ending of Mark. But it does have him changing form of the death and therefore the oil with the Mary. So you get that graces correlation. Now, the graces being the three, the cross of Christ in the context of death, the Marys or the witches are seen three Marys at the cross. Now, I'm not sure if Christians think twice about that, but you got three Marys at the cross of Christ. You have his mother Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the wife of Clopas. This is clearly the triadic concept going on, just like in Genesis 18 with the three men who interestingly there, two of them go to Sodom, one of them stays, but the three with the cross, two of them go to the tomb, the other one isn't found. But that's just common with the graces as well. Yeah, the three, it varies. That is definitely the witch concept being seen in the motif there in the Gospels with the Marys. And that would, like I said, tie into the whole meaning thing with the names, because Miriam in Numbers, she's seen as rebellious, and that's her name. So it's one of those anachronistic identifications that would just lean more towards the esoteric understanding that these stories were written, that the characters' names fit what happens in the story. How is it naming her Miriam at birth, just so later she's in this rebellious story to teach a lesson? It's obviously one of those examples. And it's the same with Shaul, with Saul. So that just ties in with the Gospels, with the Marys as well, with the witchcraft.
Yeah, your whole thing, your whole thing about the triad god or goddesses with the Marys in the way you break down the angels or the Elohim that are going to Sodom and Gomorrah is fascinating. Because we're kind of getting into that. We have a whole running Genesis thing, and we're kind of getting into Sodom and Gomorrah here. So I really appreciate that, and I encourage everyone to go check out this blog, because I think that you're brilliant, and I think that you talk about stuff that no one else is really talking about. So, but before we go, I wanted to ask you a question, because I know going down these paths it's sometimes, I don't know, enlightening. You can widen your worldview. You can kind of take in more information once you start exploring these paths. But I wanted to know if, your research and your spiritual studies have affected your life, and if it's been a positive or negative for you.
All right. Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, and the whole doing the comparative myth stuff, it's just when you start recognizing the motifs, when you start recognizing the motifs, it just really gives this whole entire other insight and perspective on what the ancients were even communicating as a people, being, just concerned with how this life should be lived on this earth, their perspectives based on just continual study or traditional, passing down of all sorts of ideas and whatnot. And so in these stories and these studies, it's not so much that you're just saying well, the Bible's just worthless, or the Metamorphosis or the Odyssey, what's the point of all this stuff? Well, a lot of these writings contain what I'd argue is just wisdom of ancient origin. A lot could be applicable in one's life. So, definitely. But like I said, my form of studying with the occult, I don't associate with many would understand that as. I view this as realistic. Actually plan and have the idea with putting after Consecrated Evil, more of a book with my personal practices kind of book, and with my personal study and the grimoire kind of ideas of what I do. But it's based off ancient origin. This doesn't mean that you just go and take anything from the. But there's a passage I like in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 in the Bible. It says, "Test all things, hold fast what is good." And even in the Apocalypse 17 in the whole Athenian context with the Greeks, he basically just quotes one of their idolatrous poets talking about God and uses that point in their religion of paganism, in his view, to make a point about Yahweh, and draws a parallel. Same thing here, that as far as just approaching texts archaeologically to learn things, it's definitely been enlightening. And so I'd encourage other fused by Christianity and you think the Bible is this kind of just, I mean, let me put this up first, is that this is not to say there's no sprinkling of Christianity among the Bible. Like I said, we have a lot of evidence of textual variation, and it's been in the hands of the church. So, Vaticanus would demonstrate that. But as far as just the content on it, it's not fitting. Like I said, we have all the Gnostic correlations and all these other things we're discussing. So the Bible should be treated no different, as far as what I'm pointing out, than all these other writings of mythology that we're looking at. And as far as the esoteric kind of, some great things can be learned from it. Like I said, the whole necromantical aspect and the traditional definition I apply in my life. And so, all these writings that you're seeing just do speak things as a display. So it's definitely enlightening.
Yeah. So the way that I kind of look at these stories, or like memes, like, people on Facebook have a meme and then they'll adjust the meme to their point of view and like move it up and change it to their thing. Does that make sense to these biblical stories in your point of view?
Yeah, because the memes are basically just,
like these are like ancient. Aha! We keep stepping each other. I'm sorry. I'll just let you talk. Go ahead, please. Go ahead. All
right. Now I was just going to say, the ancient meme is basically the proverb or the riddle. Even Jesus' parables, which is just a transliteration of, parabole in the Greek, it actually is a riddle. It's esoteric, and that's seen instance where he did not speak to them without a parable. But the point is that, that proverb principles, I want to point this out too, because I was describing the esoteric nature of like the Witch of Endor story. Basically the same essence of like just a general proverb, like you may have like give to the poor and the Lord will reward you. That simple meme or proverb, whatever you want to call it, gets put into this story of description that Jesus gives. And so that's also seen in 1 Samuel 28 when she wants to feed Saul. So little concepts of a proverb could be put into a whole story, and then just think of the astrotheological focus that the ancients have as they worship and solar eclipse connection and all that. So it's very, very interesting.
All right. So one last thing. Like I said, I was taking notes while you're talking. I think we hit everything except for one thing. We were talking about eclipses. In my brain popped this the story of Jonah, and I was wondering if there's a way, or if you're familiar with Jonah and the eclipse, and how that might work with the idea that we were talking about as the monster or the dragon or the Leviathan or Jonah's whale and the eclipse, or God being the sun figure. Do you have anything to say to that?
Actually, I got an upcoming post on the blog where I want to deal with ecliptic lore, lunar and solar. But with Jonah, it's great you go there, because the great fish, actually the Greek term used there in the Septuagint is used in one of the Leviathan passages in Job, meaning that where many of in the Septuagint, which is argued to be a translation of the Hebrew, but there's really no evidence of an actual, where you could just compare the Septuagint Greek and the Hebrew together and they're like identical, or you could see it's a translation. So it's kind of just like said, but never proven from what I've seen. But the point I'm making is that in the Septuagint, you have these Hebrew texts of Leviathan where it's usually dracon, but in one of them, it's not. It's the same term used with Jonah, with the great fish. And I find that extremely interesting because, like I said, besides the connection with things like Tiangu or skull in Norse and all that, you have this kind of in the spitting out of the sun or of the fire, which is what the ancients understood it as, like a scene in Genesis 19, when the sun comes upon the earth, that's when Yahweh reigns. Well, because he is the sun, like I showed before. But with Jonah, you have this kind of, it's seen because in the ancient world, when they're focused on the astrotheology, the solar eclipse is going to be very unique. It's very central, it seems. So, as well as the lunar, and the Bible mentions the blood moons, and of course Jesus, with the dipped in blood, of course, is the lunar eclipse, the moon dipped in blood, because you have the God in the chariot motif. That's seen with Elijah, Sol, Helios, and of course it cuts into the lunar direction as well. Chariots in the sky was the sun and moon racing, as Psalm 19 says. But he's swallowed by the great fish, comes back out. Jesus goes into the tomb, comes back out. Daniel goes into the lion's den, comes back out. That with the stone and use their ring, which just again is solar eclipse description to the core. And then, of course, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, they're cast into the fire. They come back out. This is clear parallelism in mythology. The moon, and it varies in cultures where, like the husband and wife motif with the sun and moon that's seen in Genesis with Joseph's dream, that the sun and moon, but it's actually understood as his mother, father, and brothers. And you see it in Revelation 12, but with the connection with the lunar goddess. But the point I'm making, and will be addressed in the blog post, is that these instances, going in and coming out, do parallel the ancients' understanding of the moon and sun, kind of letting go of it. So that's definitely another interesting thing they seem to be highly focused on. And of course, you have the connection, even like I said, with the dragon Dracon with Jonah.
All right, man. That's
hello.
Awesome. So,
all right.
Yeah. So, my last question is where can folks find you, your blog posts, or if you want to offer any social media links or whatever? Where can guys contact you if they have questions about this?
Right. Well, the blog, like I said, it's www.whathasbeenwritten.com. I'm on Instagram, What Has Been Written. Contacted at whathasbeenwritten@gmail.com. Like I said, Consecrated Evil, plan to release 2020. Much detail will be put into that, but in the meantime, putting out a lot of photography, things tying into my own practice. And like I said, with this whole necromancy connection and true traditional occultism, but a lot more material I want to be getting out here, because much of this stuff, like I said, like a decade of study, certain ones, but the realization of many of those is what leads into discoveries of other things. Because once you kind of get familiar with certain approaches, and that's another thing, Christians haven't got their approaches memorized, or those in opposition to Christians in debate with that much experience of theological discussion, you just kind of pick up on these things. So I definitely like to pack that into the writings as well, but also point out other people. Many people seem to just take what they heard and just reiterate it. Yeah, man. Where general knowledge is general knowledge. Yahweh the Son, that's general knowledge. But I try to point out these discoveries that I'm coming across, and really I think people may have this kind of inclined to just follow what other people are doing thing. But way I kind of approach it is, all right, that's what's said. Let me look at this for myself, and let me use all this other approach, historical approach is much more consistent. Because like I said, what you find, let me just point this out, is with dealing with history, you often get, like we said before, the dating method argument, where it's ambiguous, and they just seem contradictory or just inconsistent with that kind of stuff. The problem with just dating a manuscript back early is that we don't know if the culture that you're saying, because some people just say, well, if it dates earlier and there's a parallel, they stole it from them, which of course isn't the only explanation. You can have one coming into many and get that kind of parallel too. But the thing is that culture may have just traditionally passed it down by word about stolen and written, and then they came back and wrote their own for all we know. So we can't just be assumptive. And so in conclusion, with the historical and archaeological studies in the context of occultism, let's be consistent. Let's be honest. Let's approach the material. Let's not be biased. That's what I'm about.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating talk, and I feel like we could just keep going, but I'm going to go ahead and
definitely.
I'm going to go. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and end it. And would you give out, like, oh, I think you already did that. Did you do your social media stuff?
Like I said, well, like I said, I'm on Instagram. What has been written?
Okay.
And put photography there. I link it with the site. I got other ideas coming too, as far as just I do digital artwork as well with that. That's the other thing, I mean, people do like the equilibrium of balance. They put the bath. There's some great stuff, especially many of the 1800s that it's like I like and giving other perspectives and original work and stuff like that. So, like I said, whathasbeenwritten.com on Instagram and connected through email. And the book,
right,
like man. I said, I plan to pack much more exhaustive info in there.
All right. Hey, sorry my head wasn't in the game. I've had a rough week, but I did want to get this thing done because we've been talking about it for so long, and I really took a talk, and I want you to be like on more. I want you to be on more, podcasts that are bigger than mine, because I think that you have a lot to offer. So, if anybody, can help you or support you or read your work, like I would really, encourage that, because you have a ton of knowledge, and I feel shitty that we just happen to do this on this week, because I mean, whatever. I'm not gonna get into it, but so thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it. I would love for you to come on some other time to elaborate on some of these things, because really we touched on some stuff that really is, I think, groundbreaking and fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sounds good to me, and I appreciate having me on. And like I said, I was holding back, I feel, with much of this stuff based on the approach. But now that what has been written is kind of kicking off in the way I want it to, with the whole reconstruction of the blog and previous stuff I had back as early as like maybe late last September or so. So now, like I said, it's just kind of pushing out, getting the info out, just releasing as time allows. But I definitely appreciate it, and thanks a lot.
Yeah, man, I'm sorry for fucking up the name of your blog at the very beginning. Like, that was shitty of me, but I was just frazzled or whatever. I'm
that's fine.
Thank you for your
problem.
Thank you for your time. Yeah, thank you for your time, and I'll be in touch. We can do something soon. I mean, I think that we could literally do hours and hours of talk, and I'm looking forward for your book and all this.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot.
It is an apprentice in the order of the Abercast who now wishes to receive more light by passing to the degree of the fellow craft. He is prepared, worthy, and well qualified, and he is vouched for. Let him enter in the name of the Lord and be received in due form. Welcome to the Abercast. I'm John. Check out this preview for this Fellowcraft episode. To hear the whole episode, head over to Subscribestar and join the Fellowcraft tier. It's only $3. This whole series is available right now. It's 6 parts. Okay? It's 6 parts. It's all about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. What in the heck are the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the history of the Emerald Tablets is strange and beyond belief of modern scientists. Their antiquity is stupendous, dating back some 36,000 years before Christ. The author is Thoth, an Atlantean priest king who founded a colony in ancient Egypt. And he wrote the Emerald Tablets in his native Atlantean language, which was translated by Dr. Michael Duriel. And here we talk about it. We have 6 episodes. It's like 285 minutes of content over at the fellow craft tier at Subscribestar. That's almost 5 fucking hours of talking about these tablets. And there's much more. There's many, many more fellow craft episodes over there. So enjoy it, and I hope to see you over Subscribestar. Thanks. Harkye, O man, and list to my warning. Be ye free from the bondage of night. Surrender not your soul to the brothers of darkness, and keep thy face ever turned towards the light. Know ye not, O man, that your sorrow only has come through the veil of the night? I, man, heed ye my warning. Strive ever upwards, and turn your soul towards the light. For well know they that those have traveled far towards the sun on their pathway of light, and have great and yet greater power to bind with the darkness of the children of light. List ye, O man, to he who comes to you, but weigh in the balance of his words. Be of light, for many there are who walk in dark brightness. That's cool. And yet are not the children of light. Easy it is to follow their pathway, easy to follow the path that they lead. But yes, O man, heed my warning. Light comes only to him who strives. It's cool too. Hard is the pathway that leads to wisdom, and hard is the pathway that leads to light. Many shall ye find the stones in your pathway, many the mountains to climb towards the light. Yet know ye, O man, to him that overcometh, free will he be of the pathway of light. Follow ye not the dark brothers ever. Always be a child of light. For know ye, O man, that in the end light must conquer, and darkness and night must be banished from light. Listen, O man, and heed this wisdom, even as darkness, so is the light. When the darkness is banished and all the veils are rendered, out there shall flash from the darkness the light. Even as exists among men the dark brothers, so there exist the brothers of light, their antagonists, they of the brothers of darkness, seeking to free men from the night. Powers they have, mighty and potent, knowing the law, the planets obey. Work they ever in harmony and order, freeing the man's soul from its bondage of night. Secret and hidden walk they also, known not are they to the children of men, yet know that they walk with thee, showing the way for the children of men. Ever have they fought the dark brothers, conquering and conquering time without end. Yet always light shall in the end be master, driving away the darkness of night. So Thoth he's a glass half full kind of guy. I'm not a glass half full kind of guy. I'm not a glass half empty kind of guy. I look at the glass and I say, this glass needs to be bigger than it is. Fuck, I lost my spot. Masters, they of sun power, ever unseen, yet the guardians of men. Open to all is their pathway, open to he who will walk in the light. Free are they of dark Amenti, free of the halls where life reigns supreme. Sons are they and lords of the morning. children of light, to shine among men. Like man they are, yet are unlike, never divided where they in the past. One have they been in oneness eternal, throughout all space, since the beginning of time. Up did they come in oneness, with all one, up from the first space formed and unformed, given to man. Have they secrets that shall guard and protect him from all harm. He who would travel the path of a master, free must he be from the bondage of night. Conquer must he the formless and shapeless. Conquer must he the phantom of fear. Knowing must he gain of all the secrets, travel the pathway that leads through the darkness, yet ever before him keep the light of his goal. Obstacles great shall he meet in his pathway, yet press on to the light of the sun. Hear me, O man, the sun is the symbol of light that shines at the end of thy road. Now to thee give I the secrets, how to meet the dark power, meet and conquer the fear from the night. No, only by knowing can ye conquer, only by knowing can ye have light. Now I give thee the knowledge known to the masters, the knowing that conquers all the dark fear. Use this, the wisdom I give thee. Master thou shalt be of the brothers of night. When unto thee comes a feeling, drawing thee nearer to the dark gate, examine thine heart, and find if the feelings thou hast has come from within. If thou shalt find the darkness, thine own thoughts, banish them forth from this place in thy mind, and send through thy body a wave of vibration, irregular first and regular second, repeating time after time until free. Start the wave force in thy brain center. Direct it in waves from thine head to thy foot. This is faith healing, son. This is some secret from the fucking. This is from the fucking secret. But if thou findest thine heart is not darkened, be sure that a force is directed to thee. Only by knowing can thou overcome it. Only by wisdom can thou hope to be free. Knowledge brings wisdom, and wisdom is power. Spoken like a Gnostic. Attain, and ye shall have power over all. Seek ye first a place bound with darkness. Place ye a circle about thee, and stand erect in the midst of the circle. Use this formula, and thou shalt be free. Raise thou thine hands to the dark space above thee. Close thou thine eyes and draw in the light, and call unto the spirit of light through space-time, using these words that thou shalt be free. Fill thou my body with spirit of light. Come from the flower that shines through the darkness. Come from the halls where the seven lords rule. Name them by name. I, the 7, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9. By their names I call to aid me, free me, and save me from the darkness of night. Untanis, Queritus, Chiatal, and Goyena. Hertal, Semveda, Ardol. By their names I implore thee, free me from darkness and fill me with light. Know ye, O man, that when ye have done this, ye shall be free from the fetters that bind ye, and cast off the bondage of the brothers of night. See ye not that the names have the power to be free by vibration? The fetters that bind, use them at need to free thou thine brother, so he too may come forth from the light. Thou, O man, art thy brother's helper. Let him not lie in the bondage of night. Now unto thee give I my magic. Take it and dwell in the pathway of light. Light unto thee, life unto thee. Sun, may thou be the cycle above.
Learn more at theabracast.com. Get graphic elements, notes, worksheets, and text versions of selected episodes, as well as access to the private Abracast workgroup by signing into the mailing list. Get all that, plus exclusive episodes, by supporting the show and becoming a subscriber at subscribestar.com.